When pathologist Elaine Chambers unzipped the black body bag in her Austin laboratory on November 12, 2021, everything changed. She expected routine work because immigration detention deaths almost always came stamped with the same boring cause of death attached. Heart attack or natural causes, the paperwork would say, and another nameless body would vanish into a county burial plot forever. But the first thing her gloved fingers found was a needle mark on the dead man's neck, barely visible under the jaw. The second thing she saw made her step back from the table because boot-shaped bruises covered his ribs like a map. Handcuff abrasions circled both wrists and both ankles deep enough to suggest hours of restrained thrashing against cold metal bindings, on which she would uncover during the next 4 hours of cutting and weighing and measuring, would trigger 14 arrests across Texas. But before we reach that moment, I need you to understand something about the man lying on her steel table today. His name was Marco Antonio Galvez, and a plastic bracelet on his wrist carried a number instead of that name. He was 34 years old, born in Quetzaltenango, Guatemala, where he spent 15 years fixing engines in a shop that smelled permanently of diesel. He had thick hands with permanent grease stains under the fingernails and a laugh that his sister said could fill an entire room. 11 days before landing on this autopsy table, Marco was alive and dreaming about opening his own mechanic shop someday. Now he was case number 247 in a county morgue system that processed undocumented immigrants like defective parts on a belt. Before I tell you how the system chewed him up and spit him onto this cold steel table, I need something from you. If you believe that a human being deserves to be called by their name instead of a number, drop a comment below right now. Subscribe to this channel because stories like Marco's only survive when people refuse to scroll past them into comfortable silence and forgetting. To understand how Marco ended up dead in a Texas detention cell, we need to travel 4,000 kilometers south first. In Quetzaltenango, Guatemala, Marco shared a small concrete house with his father Raul, a 58-year-old man with trembling hands and quiet eyes. So Marco was the one who kept the generator running and fixed every neighbor's motorcycle for half the price any shop would charge them. His sister Lucia had left for Houston 3 years earlier, married an American, got her green card, and cleaned hotel rooms at the Marriott downtown. She called Marco every Sunday night and painted pictures of a country where mechanics earned in a week what he made monthly here. She told him to come north and promised she would handle the paperwork and find him a lawyer who spoke their language. Marco resisted for 11 months because leaving meant leaving Raul alone with his blood pressure pills and his failing garden outside the window. But in September 2021, Marco finally packed a single bag, kissed his father's forehead, and walked toward the border crossing. The contrast between what could have been and what actually happened is the kind of thing that keeps you staring awake. Picture Marco with his own tools in a Houston garage bay, smiling at customers and building something real with those thick, calloused hands. Now replace that image with Marco sitting in handcuffs inside a Border Patrol processing van, surrounded by 30 strangers who smelled. He was caught crossing near Eagle Pass, Texas on October 29th and processed as an undocumented immigrant with no criminal history whatsoever. The system moved fast when it wanted to, because within 48 hours, Marco was transferred to Red Rock Detention Center in Pecos County. Raul stood in his garden in Guatemala holding the phone that had stopped ringing and wondering if silence meant safety or disaster ahead. Lucia received a collect call from a number she did not recognize and heard her brother's voice say, "Everything is fine, do not worry." But his voice cracked on the word fine, and Lucia pressed her fingernails into her palm hard enough to leave 4 crescent marks. Red Rock Detention Center sat in the desert of western Texas like a concrete scar on 40 acres of dust and dead brush. The nearest hospital was 45 minutes away by ambulance, assuming anyone bothered to call an ambulance for a detained immigrant in pain. The facility was operated by Meridian Corrections Group, a private corporation that held a contract with immigration and customs enforcement worth millions. Meridian received $52 per day for every detained body inside those walls, and the math was brutally simple to understand. Our every dollar not spent on medical care or staffing or food went straight into quarterly profit reports that made shareholders smile warmly. One doctor served 1,200 detainees, and that doctor only worked 3 days per week, leaving 4 days of medical darkness every single week. Internal documents obtained later by journalists revealed that staff referred to detainees as bodies, not as people or even detainees. This place had already received 17 formal complaints from human rights organizations over the previous 4 years, and not one changed anything. The man who ran Red Rock was Warden Cliff Boyd, a 54-year-old former small-town Texas sheriff who wore cowboy boots everywhere. Boyd had a slow smile and a beer gut, and a habit of calling detained immigrants my guests, with an irony that made subordinates laugh. So he did not consider himself cruel because cruelty requires acknowledgement that the other person is human enough to suffer from your actions. For Boyd, the 1,200 people behind his walls were rows in a spreadsheet that generated revenue when occupied and cost money when sick. Then there was Dr. Neil Prescott, 47 years old, who had lost his medical license in Louisiana for prescription fraud years ago. Meridian hired doctors like Prescott because they were cheap and desperate, and they never asked uncomfortable questions about protocols or patient rights. Prescott showed up 3 days a week, signed whatever paperwork needed signing, and left before anyone could corner him with actual symptoms. This was the machine that Marco Galvez walked into on the first day of November 2021, and it was already hungry. But Marco's first day inside Red Rock was a blur of fluorescent lights, shouted commands in English he barely understood, and a cell built. He was assigned to a unit with 47 other men in a space designed for 30, and the air tasted like sweat and disinfectant. On his second day, Marco found a corner, kept his head down, and tried to memorize the rhythms of danger in this place. He called Lucia Collect and told her everything was fine because he did not want her to hear the shaking underneath his voice. She asked if he was eating, and he said yes, even though the food made his stomach turn and twist into unfamiliar knots. On the third day of November, everything inside Marco's abdomen decided to declare war on him at approximately 6:15 in the morning. The pain started as a dull ache below his navel, then migrated to his lower right side, and then exploded like a grenade made of glass. Marco screamed and pounded his fists against the steel cell door, hard enough to split the skin across both sets of knuckles open. The guards heard him, because of course they heard him, since a man screaming in agony at 6 in the morning echoes through concrete. But hearing and responding are two different actions, separated by a decision that someone makes consciously every single time it happens around them. One guard walked to the door, looked through the slot, and walked away, writing in the logbook, "Inmate is faking symptoms for transfer." Marco's cellmates began shouting too, banging on walls, trying to create enough noise to force someone in authority to actually come and look. A senior guard appeared and told the cellmates that anyone who continued making noise would be relocated to solitary confinement immediately and permanently. The cell went quiet because in Red Rock, solitary meant a concrete box with no light for 72 hours, and everyone knew that fact. This was when Derek Molina, 23 years old, former Marine, first month on the job, walked past Marco's cell and stopped breathing. He saw a man curled on the floor, clutching his abdomen with blood on his knuckles and eyes that begged without any words. Derek was Latino, born in San Antonio, but he barely spoke Spanish, and his colleagues had already made clear how things worked around here. The older guards told him, "Don't get involved because these people fake illness every week, trying to get transferred to facilities with better conditions." But Derek watched Marco's face twist with pain and felt something crack behind his sternum like a bone breaking inside his own chest cavity. He wanted to call medical, but Prescott was not on site, because this was one of his 4 days off per week of convenient absence. Derek walked away from the cell door, and the sound of Marco's fading screams followed him down the corridor like something with teeth. That night in the break room, Derek noticed the security camera monitors showing Marco still curled on the floor, not moving much anymore. He did not know yet that he would become the most important witness in a federal investigation that would shake an entire corrupt system. But something made him pull out a personal flash drive and quietly copy 12 hours of surveillance footage while nobody was watching him. The phone call that destroyed Lucia's world came on November 6th at 11:47 p.m. while she was folding hotel towels. A woman with a flat, bureaucratic voice said, "Your brother Marco Galvez died today at Red Rock Detention Center of Natural Causes." The woman said the body would be transferred to county burial services within 48 hours unless someone claimed it. Lucia stood in the Marriott laundry room, gripping a white towel so hard her knuckles turned the same color as the fabric. She did not scream because screaming was a luxury for people who had someone nearby to hear them and care. Instead, her body did something strange, because her hands stopped trembling and her voice dropped to a frequency that sounded like metal cooling. She asked the woman to repeat every word slowly, and she wrote each detail on the back of a laundry receipt. The system expected Lucia to cry, accept the words "natural causes," and let her brother disappear into an unmarked grave forever. But the system had made a catastrophic miscalculation about who it was dealing with this particular November evening in Houston. Lucia called the Pecos County morgue at 6 in the morning and demanded to see her brother's body before any burial. The clerk told her she had no legal standing because Marco was undocumented and therefore the county controlled disposition of remains. Lucia called again at 7 and again at 8 and again at 9, each time her voice getting quieter, which made it worse. By noon, she had contacted 4 lawyers, and 3 told her the same thing, which was essentially give up and grieve quietly. The 4th lawyer, a legal aid attorney named Sandra Vega, told Lucia she could file an emergency injunction to halt burial. Lucia signed papers in Sandra's tiny office, while a panic attack squeezed her chest like a fist made of concrete and wire. She hid it by pressing her thumbnail into the scar on her chin hard enough to draw a tiny bead of blood. The injunction bought Lucia 72 hours, and she spent every single one of them hunting for someone willing to examine the truth. She called 11 pathologists across Texas, and each conversation ended the same way, with a polite or not so polite refusal. One said, "Immigration detention cases attract political heat, and my practice cannot afford that kind of attention right now, unfortunately." Another simply hung up when Lucia mentioned the words private prison and wrongful death in the same sentence together. On the 3rd day, Lucia found a name buried in a 3-year-old newspaper article about a forensic report that vanished. Elaine Chambers, independent pathologist in Austin, formerly of the Travis County Medical Examiner Office, who quit over corruption. Lucia drove 3 hours to Austin with a manila envelope containing Marco's death certificate and a smaller envelope containing everything. The smaller envelope held $214 in crumpled 5s, 10s, and 20s, which was her entire savings account. Elaine Chambers opened her door and saw a small woman with a tight ponytail, a chin scar, and eyes that burned like something electrical. Lucia placed the money envelope on Elaine's kitchen table and said, "This is everything I have, but my brother deserves the truth." Elaine looked at the crumpled bills, then looked at Lucia's face and saw something she recognized from her own bathroom mirror. She took the case for $200 instead of her standard $3,000 because some debts are not measured in currency. 3 days later, Marco's body lay on Elaine's steel table, and now we return to where this story began, with context. The needle mark on his neck was not a medical treatment, because the injection site showed no corresponding entry in any medical log anywhere. Elaine found a ruptured appendix that had exploded into full peritonitis, flooding his abdominal cavity with infection that became sepsis. She set down her scalpel, looked at the ceiling, and said quietly to nobody, "This is not natural causes. This is murder." Lucia took Elaine's 14-page autopsy report to the FBI field office in Houston on a Tuesday morning, expecting justice to begin. The agent behind the desk read 3 pages, frowned, and told Lucia this falls under county jurisdiction, not federal authority, unfortunately. Lucia drove to the Pecos County Prosecutor's office 400 miles away and sat in a plastic chair for 6 hours waiting. The prosecutor's assistant finally appeared and explained that the office was reviewing the matter internally, which meant nothing would happen. On what Lucia did not know yet was that prosecutor Dale Hendricks had received $47,000 in campaign donations from Meridian Corrections. Every door she pushed closed harder than the one before it, and each rejection carried the same invisible message: stop asking questions. That night, her phone rang, and her father Raul's voice came through small and broken from 4,000 kilometers south. He said, "Déjalo ir, mija," which means, "Let it go, my daughter," because he was terrified of losing his only remaining child. Lucia sat on her apartment floor with the phone pressed against her ear and almost surrendered to her father's trembling voice. The guilt hit her like a wave, because she was the one who told Marco to come north to cross that border. She promised him paperwork and lawyers and a future, and instead, she delivered him into a concrete machine that killed him. Her chest compressed, and the panic attack she had been hiding for weeks finally broke through her defenses completely and totally. She could not breathe for 90 seconds, and the ceiling spun and Marco's face appeared behind her closed eyelids, smiling. Then her phone buzzed with a different notification, and the name on the screen changed everything because it was a threat. Her ex-husband had filed paperwork to revoke his sponsorship of her green card, and someone had paid him to do it now. Every door was closed and the walls were moving inward, but Lucia had not yet tried the one door that opens with noise. She found Taylor Reid through Twitter at 2 in the morning because desperation makes excellent search engines for finding people. Taylor was a Texas Tribune journalist, 38 years old, cynical, divorced, and running on coffee and institutional anger about injustice. Lucia sent her Elaine's autopsy report, then Taylor called back within 40 minutes, which is faster than any government agency ever responded. Taylor started pulling corporate filings for Meridian Corrections, and what she found made the Marco story look like one small chapter. Meridian had falsified medical records in 6 other detention facilities across 3 states, covering up at least 11 suspicious deaths. The Texas Tribune published Taylor's investigation on December 1st, and the story detonated across every national news network like wildfire spreading. Forque Meridian's response was immediate and vicious, because they hired a PR firm that planted stories calling Lucia a money-hungry fraud. Lucia found a photograph of her apartment building slipped under her door with no note attached, and her hands finally started trembling again. But someone else's hands were trembling too, and his name was Derek Molina, the 23-year-old guard who copied those surveillance files. Derek had not slept properly since November 3rd, because every time he closed his eyes, he heard Marco screaming through concrete. His former colleagues found him in a parking lot outside a San Antonio grocery store and beat him until 2 ribs cracked. The message was clear, but pain has a strange effect on people who already cannot live with what their silence has cost. Derek contacted the FBI with a flash drive, and this time the FBI listened because a journalist had already made ignoring impossible. He met Lucia in a federal building hallway, and she looked at him with eyes that contained both hatred and desperate need simultaneously. She said, "You watched my brother die, and you walked away." And Derek said, "I know, and I hear him every single night." The video from Derek's flash drive reached the federal prosecutor's desk on December 14th, and then it reached the internet. And 40 million people watched 11 seconds that showed exactly how a man dies when a system decides he is not human enough to save. Those 11 seconds changed everything about this case, and about the way 40 million people understand private detention forever. The video showed Marco lying on the concrete floor of his cell, with his right arm stretched toward the door. His fingers were curled slightly upward, like a man reaching for something that kept moving just beyond his desperate grasp. A guard appeared in the frame, walking with the casual rhythm of someone heading to a vending machine on break. He stopped at Marco's cell door and looked down at the dying man with an expression that contained absolutely nothing. Marco's lips moved, forming words that nobody would ever hear, because Red Rock's surveillance cameras recorded no audio whatsoever. The guard lifted his boot and pushed Marco's outstretched hand back inside the cell like sweeping trash behind furniture. Then he checked his phone, closed the door, and walked away. And those 11 seconds contained the entire broken system. The video spread across every platform faster than Meridian's lawyers could draft cease and desist letters to contain it. 40 million screens glowed with the same image of Marco's hand reaching and being kicked back into darkness by authority. CNN played the 11 seconds on loop, and commentators stumbled over words because professional vocabulary fails when confronted with casual evil. Hashtags with Marco's name trended in 14 countries, and strangers who never knew him wept in living rooms across the world tonight. Lucia watched the footage once in a hotel bathroom during her cleaning shift and vomited into a sink she had just scrubbed. She had imagined her brother's death 1,000 times, but imagination is merciful compared to security camera footage that shows everything. The country was outraged and demanding justice, and Lucia finally believed that outrage might be enough to break through walls. But outrage without jurisdiction is just noise, and the person who controlled jurisdiction had already been paid to stay silent. Pecos County Prosecutor Dale Hendricks held a press conference and announced his office found insufficient evidence to pursue criminal charges. He stood behind a podium wearing a flag pin and spoke about due process while $47,000 of Meridian money. His words were careful and lawyered, and they landed on Lucia like a door slamming shut on her fingers. The system had absorbed the public's anger, like concrete absorbs rain, turning fury into nothing but a temporary dark stain. Meridian's PR firm released a statement expressing deep sympathy while simultaneously filing defamation motions against Taylor Reid and Texas Tribune. Lucia sat on the floor of her apartment that night and felt the familiar compression of panic squeezing her lungs. Her father called again, and this time Raul did not say, "Let it go," because even he had seen the video. The county had refused, but the video had already traveled past county lines, past state lines, into a federal building downtown. Someone in the federal prosecutor's office for the Western District of Texas watched those 11 seconds and pressed play again. Then they pressed play a third time and picked up a phone that connected to the FBI's Civil Rights Division in Washington, when within 72 hours, a federal investigation was authorized and FBI agents in tactical gear entered Red Rock Detention Center at dawn. They seized computers, hard drives, logbooks, and medical records that staff had been frantically trying to shred all night long. Warden Cliff Boyd was arrested at his home, wearing cowboy boots and a bathrobe, and he smiled at the cameras outside. His smile said everything about a man who believed that money and connections would dissolve handcuffs like sugar in water. 14 people were arrested that week, including Boyd Dr. Prescott, 9 guards, 2 Meridian corporate administrators, and 1 nurse. The nurse was the one who had falsified Marco's medical records, writing normal vital signs while he bled internally. Boyd's smile disappeared during his arraignment when prosecutors played audio from Red Rock's internal radio system that recorded everything. His voice came through the courtroom speakers slow and confident, saying if they wanted health care, they should have stayed in their country. The judge looked at Boyd over her glasses and set bail at $2 million, which removed the smile permanently. Dr. Prescott was charged with involuntary manslaughter and evidence tampering for the sedative injection and the falsified death certificate. The 9 guards faced charges ranging from criminal negligence to assault, and each one claimed they were just following orders. Lucia watched the arrest footage on a television mounted in a Marriott hallway while pushing a cleaning cart past room doors. She stopped the cart and stood there watching Cliff Boyd in handcuffs, and the image mirrored something she could not forget. Boyd's wrists in steel restraints looked exactly like the handcuff abrasions Elaine Chambers had photographed on Marco's dead wrists. The trial lasted 11 weeks, and Lucia testified on a Tuesday morning wearing the only suit she owned, borrowed from coworker. She spoke Marco's name into the microphone, and her voice carried through the courtroom without trembling or breaking once. Boyd received 15 years, and Prescott received 12, and the guards received sentences ranging from 3 to 8 years. Lucia stood outside the courthouse facing CNN cameras and said, "My brother's name was Marco Antonio Galvez, remember it?" The transformation was complete because the woman who spent her entire life trying to be invisible now stood before millions. But the cameras could not see her hands shaking behind the podium or the panic medication she swallowed dry before. Derek Molina testified for 3 days, describing every detail, and after the verdict, he disappeared from public life entirely and completely. Raul called Lucia that evening crying, but this time the tears carried pride mixed with a grief that would never fully stop. Meridian Corrections Group was fined $4.2 million, which represented 0.3% of their annual revenue. To put that number in perspective, the fine was less than the cost of one floor of their corporate headquarters. 6 months after the verdict, Meridian signed a new detention contract in Georgia worth $63 million over 5 years. The system did not break because the system was never broken, since it was functioning exactly as designed from the start. A human being equals 1 row in a spreadsheet equals $52 per day, minus medical expenses equals profit for shareholders. Marco Antonio Galvez was not an anomaly or a tragic exception, but rather the predictable output of a machine built for extraction. Taylor Reid published a follow-up investigation showing Meridian had 11 similar deaths across 6 facilities in 3 different states. Each death was filed as natural causes, and each body was buried without a name, and each family was told nothing. Ana Lucia stood at a Houston cemetery on a spring morning in 2022, with Texas wind pulling at her hair. The headstone read, Marco Antonio Galvez, 1987 to 2021. Hermano hijo su nombre era Marco. For the first time in this cemetery plot, a detained immigrant had a name carved in stone instead of a number. She placed her hand flat against the cold granite and held it there, feeling nothing come back from the other side. Her phone vibrated in her pocket, and she pulled it out to see a message from Taylor Reid waiting on the screen. The message read, another death, another Meridian facility, Alabama, same symptoms, same cover-up, same falsified medical records, and same silence. Lucia looked at the message, then looked at her brother's name, carved in stone, then looked at the sky above. She typed one word and pressed send, and the word was coming because some fights do not end, they just move.